Hi, this is George Alger, and welcome to another segment of Our Ventura TV. Today's guest expert is Luther Gerlach, who is a photographic artist and an educator on historical photographic processes. Welcome, Luther.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So how is it that you evolved into working with old equipment?
Well, my father is a social and cultural anthropologist in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and I grew up traveling around the world with him and helping him photograph stuff from a really young age, and from voodoo ceremonies to grassroots movements and energy use around the world and all this kind of stuff. So he was always having cameras around, and naturally a kid, you know, likes to do what their dad does and what have you, and pick up stuff and make things. And I have horrible dyslexia. So at school it would be much easier for me to do a slide program or a little movie or a little something like this, or a book cover, instead of writing something. And so I just always inclined to work in arts, whether it was drawing or what have you, and photography, of course, was a great medium for me. It worked out really well because I love to show people things, I love to tell stories. I probably get that also from my dad. And yeah, so that's how I sort of started with the old cameras and this old stuff. Of course, I was working with, so to speak, modern equipment when I was working with my father's stuff. But when I went to the old stuff, I was simply one day, after studying and looking at all those Ansel Adams books and Edward Weston books and all that, and moving to California from Minneapolis in 1983, I was looking at these books, you know, I said, well, I really want to get into this type of photography. I've always wanted to get into larger format, bigger negatives, all the detail and what have you. Went to a camera store and simply just could not afford brand new stuff. The gentleman at the camera store said, well, there's a swap meet for cameras and stuff at the Earl Warren Showgrounds in Santa Barbara, and go there, you buy some used stuff. And after, you know, all my father's anthropological stuff and traveling around the world and seeing people use very simple equipment to make incredibly gorgeous things, it seemed rather logical for me to buy an old camera and fix it up. And then when I went to the swap meet, there were the tables and tables and tables filled with wooden cameras and these brass lenses. I didn't know that much about things at that point. But after spending 2 days, and these shows were large, I mean, they were covered the entire showground, the big rooms inside of it. And at that point, this was pre-eBay, which changed everything in that sense. But so I'd go in and I'd look at these things and I'd ask everybody every annoying question I could possibly think of to learn as much as I possibly could, gobbling up information. And so I started buying things and fixing them up and using and reading these historical manuals, these old books on how to use this stuff. And then that led to not only the cameras and the lenses, but it led to the photographic processes as well. So I've been doing this since about 1984, working in these processes.
Good. So before we get into the meat of the discussion, I just want to comment on your educational background too, because I know you're giving seminars, I believe, at Getty Museum?
Yes, for the last 10 years, since about 2005, 2004. I started working at the Getty Museum as their specialist in historical processes and technologies. When I started working in this stuff, it wasn't even, nobody knew what I was doing. I mean, it was one of those things that it wasn't on the map. Now, historical processes are all the rage because the digital revolution came along and changed everything. So now handmade processes become more interesting to people. But back when I started, there weren't any kits to buy, you know, I mean, pre-made chemistry. I went down to a school supply place that did you bought that for chemistry labs and that kind of stuff. You'd go to these places and buy the raw chemistry to teach your students how they did this. And so it was called Trias Sciences down in Los Angeles, and this place was just a warehouse of chemistry. And you went up to a counter and the guy asked you what you were going to use this stuff for, and you'd order the chemistry from him, and he'd go out and measure it, and literally an old apothecary kind of style, and measure it in little things, and you'd got this stuff, and it was mainly for schools, for chemistry labs. And that's how I got all my chemistry. And so it's really starting from the ground, I mean, from the basics. Nowadays, you can order it up. You know, I want a chemistry kit with this and this and this, and have it in the mail. But back then, no.
Good. I know you have a lot of equipment. There's so much we could speak about, but I also want to highlight that you are an artist, and I'd like to just call attention to one of these prints right here. Now, what's the media here?
Well, this is a salt print. It was the first positive and negative photographic process devised by Henry Fox Talbot. He was working on this in the 1830s, and it's literally salt and silver nitrate, silver. And what winds up being on the paper is just pure silver, elemental silver. The same silver, not sterling, but the pure elemental silver like it comes out of the ground is left and transformed by sunlight, ultraviolet radiation, into a very permanent image if done correctly. But it's a contact print. So the size of the image is the size of the negative. That's the reason I work with these big cameras. If I want a 20 by 24 inch print, it is a 20 by 24 inch negative, sometimes on commercially made film, store-bought film, or sometimes on glass plate negatives, or on waxed paper negatives, or pure paper negatives. So all these different processes. I've worked in about 30 different photographic processes.
Now, it doesn't seem like that camera is big enough to shoot this.
It is.
It is, okay.
This camera will produce a 24 by 26 inch image.
Okay.
In its largest. I built this camera a few years ago, but this is a 20 by 24 inch image.
Okay, all right, great. Well, we have a Tintype here as well.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, you know, let's switch these out. If you can push that
okay,
one
very
down
good.
Here. Good. So now, of course, not only is this made out of metal,
yes,
but it's backwards. So tell us a little about this.
Well, this is a Tintype, and a Tintype is a wet plate collodion positive on a piece of metal. Back in the day, the slang term for this process was a tintype. Tintypes meant sheet metal. It was actually the term for sheet metal, tin types. If you're a tinsmith, you cut sheet metal. You made things out of sheet metal. So since it was on a piece of metal, it was called a tintype, even though originally, historically, tintypes were on iron. They were supposed to be called ferrotypes or melanotypes, black types. So it's actually a piece of iron coated with asphalt. Yes, asphalt, raw, I mean the same stuff that's used on your streets, baked onto a piece of metal, and that was the piece of the substrate for the image. This happens to be on a modern aluminum coated with a epoxy finish. And it's the only modern part of what I do. This happens to be a 22 by 30 inch tintype, which is very, very large. Most tintypes were just a few inches by a few inches. So this is extremely large. Very hard to work this large. Also, this was photographed in a camera that I built. As you said, the image is backwards. And it's hard to understand this sometimes, what I mean by backwards, but if the image is photographed inside the camera, so the lens is projecting onto the film or the plate, and I'm viewing it this way, but it's photographed that way. So every photograph in the history of photography, every digital image, your eyeballs, every drop of water produces an image upside down and backwards. But since you're able to flip the film around or the glass plate around to print with, or your digital image has a computer brain inside of it and the brain flips it around, and in your eye you have the brain behind it and that flips the image around. Apparently, if I would hang somebody upside down for about 5 days, their brain would flip it around so they'd be seeing the right way even though they were hanging upside down. And tests like this have been done. So it's kind of interesting. But
okay. What years were what years was this contemporary?
Oh, I photographed this about 2012, I believe this was taken. This was taken for a show that I did at the Ventura Museum here, filled with images photographed in Ventura County. And of course, this is the fairground, the day before it opens. Hence, the people disappeared. Now, this exposure is about 2 minutes long.
Okay.
So very, very long exposure. So even when people walk through my shots, I don't see them. One of the best ways for me to get rid of people is increasing the length of exposure. And the longer I expose, the more people can walk in front of it, and the less people are in the photograph.
Right. And when were tintypes most prevalent in history?
Good question. This process was invented in 1852 in England. And, but it really came to the United States in about 1860 and really took over pretty much all photographic mediums at that point. At that point you had daguerreotypes and then the salt prints that you saw earlier. This process also produces actually a negative. If it's on clear glass, it's a negative that can be printed on. If it's on metal, it looks like a positive and acts like a positive. So it's the actual piece of film in the camera, very much like an historical Polaroid. It's the piece of film in the camera. So there's only one of these. It's the only one that exists. Right. Versus the image on the paper, I can print that over and over and over again from a negative.
But when the salt prints were contemporary,
yes.
It was actually around the same time as the tintypes?
About 20 years earlier.
20 years earlier, okay.
But there's crossover and everything.
Good. Okay, so in terms of educating the public about historical processes, there is so many technologies, there is
yes.
a lot of different things you could speak about. What are some of what you might describe as the highlights of the evolution?
Evolution of photography?
Yeah.
The highlights?
Or the historical aspect
right.
of photography?
Well, of course, the first patented process, the daguerreotype, a piece of copper-plated silver with iodides and bromides fumed onto the plate, becomes light sensitive, a piece of silver-plated copper, yes, light sensitive, put into a camera, exposed, very much like the tintype here, exposed, and then developed in mercury vapor. Horrible stuff. And when this process was first invented, of course, you know, you didn't really have all the writing of what chemistry made you ill, and so people would have problems with this. And it was called all these processes were photography. One of its nicknames in the very beginning were the dark arts. It was done in a dark room, camera obscura. You needed a dark room to process. You're always running into that little black, room with sometimes red light, and there was a very dim lit room. And so the dark arts, and also because of some of the chemical dangers with it.
Okay.
So that was the daguerreotype.
And that went through the Civil War.
That was slightly used in America during the Civil War. This process picked up at that point.
Okay.
Partially wet plate collodion, which this is a member of that family, so wet plate collodion. And so that uses collodion poured onto either a glass plate to make a negative with, to print with, or tintypes. And tintypes really became very popular during the Civil War for one big reason, other than their price. The price point was way down compared to daguerreotype. But the main reason was that it was flexible. So what you could do is you could take that photograph, you put it in a little envelope, and you could send it to your loved ones. And so it would get there. See, on glass, of course, you run the risk of it breaking.
Right.
So the ambrotype, the wet plate collodion image on glass versus the tintype on metal, the glass image could break. And plus, those glass images had to be put in those little boxes that you open up, and you see that beautiful little image inside. Daguerreotypes, that technology came from the daguerreotype, and then was used to house ambrotypes. So the images on glass, it's an ambrotype.
And when did the negative become into existence? Because I guess that superseded all of this.
Not all of it. The daguerreotype, of course, was the first patented process, and that's on a piece of silver-plated copper. And that's a positive inside that was directly from the camera. So it doesn't have a negative. Okay? So it's a positive like a Polaroid. It's exactly what you see. And, but the first, actually before the daguerreotype was invented, Henry Fox Talbot was working on making positive and negatives in England. And he worked on using sheets of paper. So the negative was not on a piece of cellulose or plastic or glass. It was on a piece of paper. Beautiful quality to it. But the problem was, of course, that paper, when you shine light through that piece of paper, it leaves traces of what the paper substrate is, which is fibers. So it has a little bit of a fibrous look, so a softer look, very pictorial, very beautiful process, but always had the problem of sharpness. And also the process, very long exposures, and pretty much just potassium iodide and silver nitrate and on a piece of paper brushed on. And it was just a very slow process, and didn't leave a real sharp image. Now, when glass came along as a substrate for this collodion, this wet plate collodion, collodion actually, is interesting enough, is made out of cotton. Cotton balls dissolved in nitric and sulfuric acid. It was the liquid Band-Aid during the Civil War. And that would be poured onto a piece of glass. So very simply, if I'm holding a piece of glass, I hold the glass by the corner, I take this liquid, which is a syrup very much like, it's kind of like maple syrup. It almost looks that way in thickness. And I pour that onto the glass in a little puddle into one corner, one corner, one corner, one corner, drain it off, and I put it into a bath of silver nitrate. That collodion has iodides and bromides in it. The silver nitrate attacks to the iodides and bromides and making a light-sensitive compound on that piece of glass. That's put into the camera, exposed, developed with iron solutions, believe it or not, developed, and the exposure sometimes can be 4 or 5 minutes long. So very long exposure. So if I'm shooting a portrait, the person has to hold very, very still. If out in landscape and stuff where I need lots of depth of field, and it has to be dripping wet in the camera, which means that if it dries, it's no longer sensitive to light. And all these problems come into play. So I ask myself all these different questions before I go off and photograph about what I can do, what I can't do. What does the process allow me to do? What can I get away with? And I'm always kind of pushing that right to its extremes. And that's what I really love. It really pushes me as an artist to ask these questions, to come up with the best solution given all the, compromises that these processes have. And that's one of the things I really love about it.
So, well, Luther, I would love to ask you so many more questions, but we're out of time.
Yes.
But before we go, I'm wondering if you could provide a website where people could go for more information, and if you have a summating message for the viewers.
Yes, well, Photography.com, and that'll be up again very soon. I guess what I always try to bring forth when I talk to people about this is when they pick up those old photographs, they aren't just look at them in a different type of a way. Look at them with the technology in mind when you look at that image. Realize what went into that image, the difficulty compared to the digital iPhone click, 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 click that we see now, or even store-bought film and sending it off to, drugstore lab. And, look at it, appreciate it from all different aspects, and maybe you'll see an image in a different way and look at it a little bit differently.
Well said. Thank you, Luther.
Thank you.